Hello, and welcome to Plotfall. Our focus this evening rests on the story of life of a miner during the Industrial Revolution. Before we begin, if you find value in these stories, perhaps take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps others find the channel. You can also let me know in the comments where you're listening from and the time. It's always fascinating to see our quiet community grow around the world. Now find a comfortable position, perhaps dim the lights or turn on a soft fan for background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. The world was beginning to hum with a new, restless energy. Picture, if you will, a landscape slowly, almost imperceptibly, changing its ancient rhythms. The air itself began to carry new scents, a faint, metallic tang mingling with the familiar smells of wood smoke and damp earth from the fields that still dominated much of the view. The rhythmic clang of the village blacksmith, once a steady heartbeat, was now occasionally punctuated by a more insistent, distant thrum, the early, hesitant breath of infant industry. Green pastures, once stretching uninterrupted to the horizon, started to see their edges nibbled away by the slow creep of brick and the darker stain of coal dust, settling lightly from unseen sources. But the true, formidable engine of this dawning transformation wasn't yet fully visible above ground, in the clatter of new looms or the puff of experimental steam. It lay sleeping, a dormant giant, deep within the belly of the earth. Beneath the rolling hills and the quiet moors, under layers of clay and stone, waited a power untold. Vast, black seams of coal, the compressed carbon remains of forgotten forests from epochs past, snaked through the darkness like subterranean rivers. Intermingled, often nearby, lay rich deposits of iron ore, a rusty promise of the strength that would soon forge a new age. This wasn't just inert rock and dirt, it was potential energy, raw and immense, a dark, buried treasure that whispered of heat, of light, of relentless motion, a treasure that would soon be, with great effort and often great suffering, brought into the light. And so, that whisper of heat, of light, of relentless motion began to find its voice. It wasn't a sudden shout, but a steadily growing murmur, then a distinct rumble, echoing from the workshops and the foundries where innovation was taking fiery metallic form. The first steam engines, those magnificent, often temperamental wheezing beasts of polished iron and hissing steam, coughed into laborious life. Their pistons rose and fell, their flywheels turned with a newfound relentless power, a power that promised to reshape the very fabric of society. And their hunger, their hunger for this black rock, for the coal, was utterly insatiable. Imagine the landscape beginning to change, almost imperceptibly at first, then with gathering speed. A new kind of smoke, thick, acrid, and almost constantly pluming, started to stain the skies above fledgling industrial towns, a visible, olfactory announcement of the change. This wasn't the gentle, aromatic wood smoke of a cottage hearth carrying hints of baking bread. This was the raw, sulfurous breath of burgeoning industry. Factories, like great, shadowed behemoths constructed from stark brick, began to rise, their many-windowed eyes staring out over fields that had, for centuries, known only the quiet rhythm of the plow and the scythe. Inside these structures, the clatter and whir of machinery created a deafening metallic symphony of relentless production, a sound that would soon define an entire era. This black diamond, wrested from the deep earth, became the undisputed lifeblood of a rapidly transforming world, the invisible energy coursing through the iron veins of this new age. The demand wasn't merely local, it was a creeping, then a galloping, all-consuming need that spread like an unstoppable tide. Every new invention, every ambitious enterprise, every flickering gas lamp in a city street seemed to cry out for more. More coal to smelt the iron for rails and bridges. More coal to power the engines in ships and trains. More coal to warm the homes and fuel the ovens of a growing population. This ravenous appetite set the stage, a vast, dark, and deeply demanding stage, for the human drama that would unfold far beneath the sunlit world. But coal, as all-consuming as its hunger became, wasn't the only treasure wrested from the earth's deep, unwilling pockets. The dark veins that bled black diamonds were not alone. Other seams, other lodes, pulsed with different promises, different colors. The rusty blush of iron ore, the quiet gleam of tin, the muted warmth of copper. Each carried its own weight, its own texture, its own destiny in the world above, a silent counterpoint to the reign of King Coal. Imagine for a moment the heft of raw iron ore in a calloused hand. A heavy, unassuming rock, perhaps stained a deep ochre or a stubborn earthy red. This was the raw material not just of simple tools or sturdy plows, but of the very skeleton of this new age. From these unprepossessing stones smelted in the roaring throats of furnaces that painted the night sky with their infernal glow, would flow the molten lifeblood for colossal machines, for the endless ribbons of railway tracks snaking across continents, for the soaring arches of bridges that defied gravity and expectation. The rhythmic clang of the smith's hammer on cooling iron was the insistent heartbeat of progress, a harsh lullaby for a rapidly transforming world. Then there was copper, softer, more malleable, revealing a reddish gold sheen when coaxed from its rocky cradle deep within the earth. It found its purpose weaving through the intricate guts of new technologies, in the gleaming pipes that promised cleaner water to burgeoning, thirsty cities, and as a resilient shield against the relentless sea on the hulls of ever larger ships. Tin, too, played its crucial, if often understated part. It was a silvery whisper against the encroaching rust, lending its subtle strength to alloys, a quiet, almost invisible guardian in this relentless march of metal. These humble offerings from the dark earth, each particle dug with immense human effort, often with sorrow and sacrifice, were the essential ingredients for the glittering, often unforgiving face of industrial might. But this relentless extraction, this insatiable hunger for the earth's hidden treasures, began to paint a new, often starkly dramatic picture upon the land itself. Slowly at first, like a creeping shadow, then with gathering, undeniable speed, the familiar greens and browns of rolling hills and quiet, pastoral valleys found themselves profoundly interrupted. Gaunt skeletal structures, the pitheads began to claw at the horizon. Imagine rough-hewn timber, weathered and gray, later perhaps the stark, unyielding black of iron, cobbled together into a functional framework that was both a beacon of industrious promise and a rather grim sentinel overlooking the changing world. From these structures, a near-constant plume of smoke might rise, a sooty exhalation against a sky that itself, in some areas, seemed to grow perpetually dimmer, stained by the ceaseless breath of coal. And with the gaping mouths of the pits came their ever-growing shadows, the slag heaps. These were not mountains born of ancient geological time, patiently sculpted by wind and rain, but new, raw, man-made ranges of industrial refuse. Picture them growing, almost organically, day by day, a creeping tide of dark, gritty waste, discarded shale, worthless stone, clouds of choking coal dust, slowly, inexorably burying the soft grass, the tenacious wildflowers, the very memory of what lay just beneath the surface. The air itself, once crisp with the scent of pine or damp earth, might now carry a different, more acrid perfume, a metallic tang, a persistent hint of sulfur, overlaying and sometimes overpowering the old, familiar smells of the natural world. These were the new monuments, perhaps unintentional in their starkness, yet powerful, unavoidable symbols of an age that burrowed deep and discarded openly, reshaping the very face of the earth. And beneath these reshaped horizons, where the scent of sulfur now mingled with the distant memory of pine, a great stirring was underway. A slow, reluctant tide of humanity was turning. Why? You might softly ask yourself, would anyone trade the familiar caress of the wind across open fields, even fields that offered a meager living, for the stark, scarred landscapes blooming around the pitheads? For many, the fields themselves were ceasing to be theirs. Common lands, those ancient shared patches of green where a family might have grazed a precious bony cow or gathered winter fuel, were vanishing, enclosed by unforgiving new fences, stark lines drawn across generations of tradition. The very texture of rural life was fraying, thread by thread. Imagine the silence in a cottage where laughter once echoed, now filled only with the gnawing anxiety of an empty larder. A string of failed harvests could turn the sweet smell of rain on dry earth into a bitter reminder of what wouldn't grow, the damp soil offering no comfort, only a cold mirror to their despair. New, clattering machines on distant, wealthier farms might mean your strong hands, hands that knew the rhythm of scythe and plow, were no longer sought, their skill suddenly devalued. So, with hearts heavy as the damp wool of their thin cloaks, families looked towards the dark plumes staining the horizon, the smudges of industry against a pale sky. It wasn't a brightly painted dream of riches that pulled them, but more often the grim specter of starvation pushing them from behind. The rumors of work in the mines were just that. Rumors tinged with the metallic taste of fear, yet carrying the faintest, almost desperate scent of possibility. Those rumors, like whispers on the wind, would sometimes coalesce into something more solid, something almost tangible. A cousin's letter, perhaps, arriving smudged with actual coal dust, the black powder a gritty testament to the work, but promising real coin, enough to quiet a child's hungry cries for a night or two. Or sometimes, a traveler, pausing for breath in a depleted village, would speak of new shafts being sunk miles away, of men needed, their voice low and gravelly in the flickering light of a dwindling tavern fire, the words themselves a fragile spark of hope in the gloom. These were the threads of genuine need, the raw demand for bodies to wrestle treasure from the earth's stubborn grip. But then there were other voices, smoother, more confident, that began to echo through the impoverished countryside. Men would arrive, often in slightly too loud waistcoats for their humble surroundings, their boots perhaps a little too polished for the muddy tracks they traveled. These were the recruiters, their tongues well-oiled, painting vivid pictures of bustling mine towns with shops full of goods, and wages as regular as a church bell. They'd speak of camaraderie and purpose, conveniently glossing over the cramped, damp cottages, the ever-present cough that rattled in a man's chest, or the simple fact that the sun might become a forgotten memory. Their hastily printed flyers, if they bothered with such things, would likely show smiling, hearty families, the pervasive coal dust artfully omitted. It wasn't always a grand, deliberate deception, mind you. Sometimes the recruiters themselves were only a small step removed from the very desperation they sought to exploit, perhaps eager to believe their own embellished tales of prosperity. Yet the rosy tint they applied to the life underground, the inviting warmth they conjured with their words, often faded with brutal swiftness upon arrival. The truth, as it so often does, lay somewhere far colder and harder, and so, pulled by a carefully crafted promise, or more often relentlessly pushed by the undeniable emptiness of their bellies, families would make the journey towards those dark plumes on the horizon, towards an unknown and frequently unforgiving future. And as those plumes grew closer, resolving themselves into the stark silhouettes of headstocks and engine houses, a new kind of settlement would begin to take shape around them, clinging to the colliery like limpets to a rock. These were the pit villages, springing up almost as if conjured from the coal dust itself, appearing with astonishing speed, often before any proper roads or sanitation could even be considered. Imagine, if you will, arriving not to an established town with ancient roots, but to a sprawling collection of dwellings hastily thrown together, their timber perhaps still green and damp, their roofs often little more than tarred felt or slate, battling the persistent northern drizzle. Rows of identical grim little boxes, stretching out under a perpetually gray sky. The air itself would carry the constant, low hum and occasional jarring shriek of the machinery from the pithead, a mechanical heartbeat for a community tethered entirely to the dark maw of the earth nearby. The scent of coal smoke, acrid and inescapable, would be a permanent fixture, mingling with the smell of damp earth, overworked bodies, and the less pleasant, ever-present aroma of overcrowded living in rudimentary conditions. These weren't just places people lived. They were outposts, utilitarian and stark, existing for one reason alone, to serve the mine. The rhythm of life, the very breath of the village, was dictated by the shift whistle, by the clanking of the winding gear. Every mouthful of food, every scrap of clothing, was ultimately bought with the black diamonds wrested from below, each piece a tiny testament to the village's singular, all-consuming purpose. And from that singular purpose, that all-consuming mine, sprang the rows of identical dwellings. Imagine stepping towards one such cottage, perhaps late in the evening, the only light spilling from a small, grimy window. These weren't homes built with love or individual character, but utilitarian boxes of stone or brick thrown up quickly by the mining company itself. The roof, likely slate, would offer some protection, but the walls often felt thin against the biting wind or the persistent drizzle. Push open the rough wooden door. It probably wouldn't even have a proper lock, or if it did, it would be a simple, flimsy thing. Inside, the space is almost shockingly small. Often just one room downstairs, perhaps two, that served as kitchen, living room, and dining area all in one. The floor might be bare earth, cold and damp underfoot, or perhaps uneven stone flags. Look around. You wouldn't see much in the way of comfort. A rough-hewn table, a few rickety stools or a single bench, maybe a trunk for the family's meager possessions. The air would be thick with the smell of coal smoke from the hearth, the only source of heat, mingling with the aroma of whatever simple, often repetitive meal was being prepared, and the ever-present scent of unwashed bodies and damp wool. Up a narrow, creaking ladder or a steep staircase if you were lucky, a cramped attic or loft space would serve as the bedroom for the entire family. Straw paillasses on the floor, a few coarse blankets shared between parents and children. Privacy was a forgotten luxury here. Every cough, every sigh, every muttered word in the night would be shared. And always, the subtle understanding that this small, crowded shelter wasn't truly yours. It belonged to the company. Another tie binding you to the dark world beneath the ground. Another reminder of who held the reins of your life. A brief, fragile refuge before the pit called again. And so, the pit does call again, long before any hint of dawn considers painting the sky. The darkness inside the cramped cottage is profound, a thick, inky blanket that clings to everything. It's a cold that seeps deep into your bones, a damp chill that the shared body heat of your sleeping family can only partially hold at bay. The first sounds are almost too quiet to register, almost imperceptible shifts in the silence. A soft rustle of straw from a nearby palliasse, perhaps, or the almost silent thud of bare feet meeting a cold, grimy floorboard as your father or mother begins to stir. There's no gentle awakening here, no stretching languidly into the morning light, for there is no light yet. It's a reluctant peeling away from the thin solace of sleep, a return to the aches that yesterday's brutal labor etched into muscle and bone. A child might cough, a small, dry sound quickly muffled by a parent's gentle hand, a quiet murmur of, "Hush now." The air itself feels heavy, stale with the scent of too many bodies crammed into too small a space, and the faint, ever-present ghost of coal dust clinging to clothes, to hair, to the very walls. Imagine yourself there, a child in that gloom, eyes barely open. You see only silhouettes moving against the slightly less dark square of a tiny, dirt-streaked window. You hear the low, weary whispers as the adults prepare, the clink of a spoon against a tin cup as a meager breakfast of watery porridge or stale bread is prepared, if anything at all. There's no real conversation, not in these early hours. Just the necessary sounds of a life lived on the very edge of exhaustion. A shared, unspoken understanding of the grueling day to come. A quiet ritual of resignation before facing the descent once more. Another day beginning in the dark, destined for more darkness. And as he disappears from view, a shadowy figure swallowed by the earth, another day truly begins for the woman left behind. His descent is her ascent into a different kind of toil, one fought not with pickaxe and shovel, but with a needle, a scrubbing brush, and a mind constantly calculating stretching pennies that felt like smooth, worn stones, too few and too small to fill the gaps. The air in their small cottage, rarely free of the faint metallic tang of coal dust, would already be thick with the day's demands. Imagine her, perhaps, sweeping the packed earth floor, the rough bristles of the broom whispering secrets of endless repetition. Laundry, a monumental task, involved hauling water, scrubbing with harsh soap until knuckles were raw, wringing out heavy, sodden cloth with aching arms, then hanging it to dry in a yard often choked with smoke and grime, hoping the soot wouldn't mar her efforts before they were even complete. There was mending, always mending, clothes worn thin by friction and time, passed down until they were little more than a patchwork of memories and diligent stitches. And then, the alchemy of the kitchen, how to conjure sustenance from almost nothing. A bit of barley, perhaps some watery broth, the occasional potato if the harvest was kind or the price not too steep. Meat was a distant dream, a luxury reserved for feast days that rarely came. She was the silent mathematician of their survival, balancing hunger against the few coins her husband might bring home, coins already earmarked for rent, for fuel, for the tallow candles that did little to push back the encroaching darkness. Every cough from a child, every distant rumble from the colliery was a fresh knot of anxiety in her stomach. Her worry was a constant companion, an invisible cloak she wore day and night, a testament to the heavy, unseen burdens carried on shoulders that also had to be strong enough to comfort and to keep a fragile household from completely falling apart. Those few coins her husband might bring home, if he brought home actual coins at all. Often, it wasn't the reassuring clink of copper or silver that would meet a waiting hand, but something else entirely. Perhaps it was a flimsy piece of printed paper, a script note, or a roughly minted metal token, cold and impersonal, bearing the company's stark insignia instead of the king's familiar profile. These weren't universally accepted currency. Oh no, they were a special kind of money. Their power confined to one specific place, the company's store, often grimly known to the miners as the Tommy shop or the truck shop. Imagine, if you will, stepping into this establishment. The air might be thick with a curious mix of smells. Stale flour, damp wool from rough-spun cloth, the harsh scent of cheap soap, and perhaps the faint, cloying sweetness of overpriced sugar or the yeasty aroma of watered-down beer. The shelves wouldn't exactly groan with abundance. Instead, you'd find a sparse collection of basic necessities. Gritty flour, perhaps some fatty bacon, coarse tea, often of a quality that wouldn't pass muster elsewhere. Each item marked up to a price that felt like a fresh, quiet insult after a week of back-breaking work underground. Your tokens, your hard-earned wages, suddenly felt lighter, their purchasing power mysteriously diminished within these four walls. And so the subtle, insidious cycle began. The tokens, or the credit against future earnings, bought just enough to scrape by, but rarely enough to clear the slate entirely. If vital supplies ran short before the next uncertain payday, and they often did, credit was extended, of course, at this very company store. This credit, this ever-deepening tally perhaps chalked up on a dusty slate, or meticulously noted in a ledger, became another chain, invisible but incredibly strong. It bound the miner and his family ever tighter to the colliery, to the will of the owners, ensuring that the meager fruits of their dangerous labor flowed almost inevitably back into the pockets of those who held all the power, leaving behind only the bitter taste of dependence and the gnawing weight of inescapable debt. With the weight of that debt a constant, dull ache in the back of the mind, and the day's brutal labor etched into every muscle, what then was left for leisure? The word itself might have sounded like a cruel jest in those dim, flickering gaslights, or the deeper gloom of a miner's cramped cottage. Evenings were short, swiftly swallowed by the need to prepare for the morrow's descent, to simply exist until the pit called again. Imagine, if you will, returning to your smoky dwelling, the air thick with the smell of damp, coal smoke from a reluctant fire, and perhaps a simmering, meager stew. The coal dust, a stubborn companion, would still cling to your skin, your hair, mingling with the scent of sweat and earth. Sometimes, perhaps, if the exhaustion wasn't entirely all-consuming, and if a few precious pennies had somehow escaped the company store's relentless grasp, there was a flicker of something more. A brief visit to the alehouse, the air hazy with cheap pipe smoke and the low murmur of shared grievances, might offer a fleeting, noisy distraction. More often, though, in the close-knit huddle of the mining village, a song might rise into the damp air. A rough, untutored melody, sung by voices hoarse from dust and shouting commands in the echoing tunnels, carrying tales of hardship, of longing, or a defiant, darkly humorous spark. It wasn't grand entertainment, just a shared breath, a moment of fragile human connection in the prevailing gloom. But for many, more often than not, leisure was simply the blessed relief of stillness, a state bordering on collapse. The profound quiet of a body too tired to move, too weary to think beyond the immediate, desperate need for rest. A stolen hour, perhaps, hunched by a feeble fire, its meager light casting long, dancing shadows like specters on the rough, soot-stained walls before sleep, heavy and deep as the mine itself claimed you. A sleep that was less a gentle drift into peaceful dreams and more a sudden fall into oblivion, a brief necessary escape before the darkness of the pre-dawn and the waiting pit beckoned once more. That beckoning call arrives all too soon. Long before any hint of dawn dares to soften the harsh edges of the night, a bone-deep weariness, or perhaps the familiar gnawing in your belly, rouses you from that brief oblivion. The air inside your cramped cottage is thick with the smell of stale sleep and lingering coal dust, a gritty perfume that clings to everything, a constant reminder of your life's work. Stepping out from the relative stillness of your dwelling, the cold is a physical blow, sharp and unforgiving, a stark awakening. Now picture yourself setting out, not into the gentle light of morning, but into a world still entirely swallowed by darkness. The path ahead, stretching for what feels like an eternity, often several arduous miles, is little more than a muddy, rutted track, treacherous underfoot. Your boots, if you are fortunate enough to own a sturdy pair, offer meager protection against the sharp stones and the insidious dampness that seeps upwards, chilling you to the marrow. Sometimes, a bitter wind howls across the desolate landscape, or a persistent fine drizzle begins to fall, soaking through your threadbare clothes, adding its own miserable weight to your already burdened shoulders. You might walk alone, wrapped in the solitude of your own tired thoughts, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent darkness. Or perhaps you join a silent, trudging procession of other shadows, men and boys, their faces etched with fatigue, all heading towards the same dark maw of the earth. The only sounds breaking the profound quiet might be the rhythmic squelch of boots in mud, the collective rasp of tired breathing, an occasional, low cough echoing in the pre-dawn stillness. There are no birds singing you on your way just yet. The world is still holding its breath, just the relentless, monotonous rhythm of one foot placed carefully in front of the other, moving inexorably towards the pit head, perhaps a faint, distant glow in the inky blackness, or simply a known point in the gloom that signals the true beginning of your toil. And then it rises before you from the gloom, the pit head, a stark skeletal framework against the bruised pre-dawn sky, its great winding wheel a dark halo. For a moment it might seem a silent, patient sentinel, but the air itself soon trembles. A low, guttural rumble vibrates through the soles of your worn boots, the first stirrings of the Colossus. The air grows thick, not just with the damp chill, but with the sharp, gritty tang of coal dust and the pervasive metallic scent of oil from the machinery. The hiss of steam, a rhythmic, powerful sigh from the unseen winding engine, joins the growing chorus. You hear the metallic clank of heavy chains being checked, the groan of stressed timber. Other figures emerge from the darkness, drawn like moths to this grimy, flickering lamplight. Men, mostly, their faces already etched with the lines of fatigue and smudged with yesterday's toil. And boys, too, some so young, their shoulders barely reach a man's waist, their small frames shivering slightly in the cold morning air, perhaps clutching a cold piece of bread. They huddle in small groups, voices low, a shared language of nods and weary grunts, the older ones offering no comfort, just shared resignation. Towering above is the headgear, a latticework of iron and wood. The massive wheel at its apex, now slowly beginning to turn with a protesting shriek of metal, is what will lower the cage, your conveyance, into the blackness. It's a surprisingly simple mechanism for such a daunting drop, really. Just a thick, greasy rope, that giant wheel, and perhaps a silent prayer, though most here have probably run out of those long ago, bartered for another day's bread. The cage itself, often little more than a rickety iron box, perhaps open to the elements on its sides, clunks heavily into position at the pit mouth. A chilling gust of damp, cool air, heavy with the scent of wet rock, stale water, and something ancient, vaguely metallic, wafts up from the shaft. It's a smell you'll come to know intimately, the very breath of the underworld, a constant companion to your days. There's no orderly queue here, just a tired, resigned press of bodies, each man knowing the grim routine, the unspoken rules of who shuffles forward first, often dictated by weary proximity or a subtle hierarchy of exhaustion. The cold, often slick metal of the cage floor is uneven and gritty beneath your worn boots. You squeeze in, if squeeze is even the word for it. It's more like being compressed, shoulder to shoulder, back to chest. The only personal space, a fiercely guarded grip on your flickering lamp. The air within this cramped confines instantly thickens with the smell of unwashed bodies, the ever-present coal dust that lines your throat, and the damp, earthy wool of your clothes. For a long moment, there's a profound stillness, a collective, almost prayerful holding of breath, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow drip, drip, drip of unseen water, echoing from somewhere deep within the earth's cold heart. Then, with a sudden, stomach-lurching jolt and a deafening screech of protest from the winding gear far above, the cage begins its juddering descent. Daylight and the world of the living shrinks rapidly to a distant, indifferent star, then winks out entirely. Or, if this particular colliery clung to older ways, or if the cage was out of action, a common enough occurrence, it wouldn't be this sudden plummet. Imagine, instead, an endless, near-vertical climb down treacherous wooden ladders, rung by slippery, mud-caked rung, your lamp swinging precariously, casting wild, untrustworthy shadows on the wet, weeping shaft walls. Your arms and legs would burn with an acidic fire, your knuckles scrape raw against the unforgiving rock. Each downward step would be a careful calculation, a grim gamble against gravity in the suffocating, echoing dark. Perhaps the cage, for all its sudden heart-stopping terror, is the marginally lesser of two evils. Now the darkness is absolute. The only sounds, the rhythmic groaning of the rope and the metallic rattle of the cage as it plummets ever deeper. The small circle of daylight far above, the pit eye, shrinks with every juddering foot you fall. It recedes, a distant, indifferent star, until it winks out entirely, leaving you in a profound, almost liquid blackness. This isn't just the absence of light, it's a presence, thick and enveloping, a darkness that feels as though you could reach out and touch its velvety, cold surface. A blackness so complete it seems to swallow the very air around you. The air changes too, growing noticeably colder, seeping into your thin clothes, raising gooseflesh on your skin despite the eventual heat of your labor. It carries the damp, earthy breath of the deep places, a smell of wet stone, of stale air undisturbed for centuries, and perhaps the faint, acrid tang of coal dust already beginning to tickle your nostrils, a prelude to the gritty film that will soon coat everything. You can almost taste the mineral tang on your tongue, a constant reminder of the rock pressing in from all sides, the immense weight of the world resting just above your head, a silent, sleeping giant. The sounds of the surface world are long gone, replaced by the intimate symphony of the shaft. The rhythmic sigh of the winding gear far above, now a ghostly whisper, and the persistent drip, drip, drip of water seeping through unseen fissures, each drop echoing with an exaggerated clarity in the oppressive void. It's a journey not just downwards, but into a different realm entirely, a place never meant for sunlight or for easy breath. The cage continues its descent, a small, fragile box suspended in an immensity of rock and shadow, carrying you further from the familiar and deeper into the earth's often unwelcoming embrace, towards the dimly lit galleries where your day truly begins. The cage shudders, then settles with a final metallic sigh, its journey into the earth, complete for now. The gate, a crude barrier of wood or iron, creaks open, and you step out. It's not so much onto solid ground, as it is into another world, a realm carved from rock and shadow. The air that greets you is a palpable presence, thick and cool, clinging to your skin and carrying a complex perfume. The damp, earthy scent of wet stone, the sharp, mineral tang of raw coal, and the faint, almost metallic aroma of stale air that has not known the sun for an eternity. Your eyes, already accustomed to the deeper gloom of the shaft, begin to make out the oppressive confines of this new level. Perhaps a single flickering tallow candle, its flame struggling bravely, casts long, dancing shadows down a narrow passage. Or maybe the smoky halo of an oil lamp carried by a fellow miner offers a slightly wider, though still pitifully small, circle of visibility. Around you, the walls glisten with moisture, the rock rough and cold to the touch. The ceiling is low, oppressively so, forcing a stoop even in the main galleries, a constant reminder of the immense weight of the earth above. Distant sounds begin to filter through the heavy silence. The rhythmic, muffled thud of a pickaxe biting into the coal seam, the creak of timber supports groaning under pressure, the constant, meditative drip of water finding its way through ancient fissures. This is your workplace, a labyrinth of man-made tunnels where the sun is a forgotten memory, and the day is measured not by light, but by the ache in your back and the dwindling flame of your lamp. And then there is the air itself, a tangible presence in these deep passages, a constant companion to the sounds and the oppressive closeness. Each breath you draw is heavy, thick with the gritty taste of the earth. Fine, black dust, disturbed by every movement, every strike of the pick, hangs suspended in a perpetual, swirling haze. It's a powder so fine it invades everything, coating your skin with a greasy film, lining your throat, and settling deep within your lungs with every weary inhalation. You can almost feel it, a subtle weight, a constant tickle. This airborne grit paints the dim, flickering light from your lamp a murky, diffuse orange, further obscuring the already shadowy tunnels. Beneath the oppressive cloud of dust, a persistent dampness pervades. The air is cool, almost cold in the deeper galleries, a clammy embrace that seeps through your thin, sweat-soaked clothes, chilling you to the bone despite the heat of your exertion. It carries with it the faint, metallic tang of raw minerals and wet, ancient stone, a primal scent of the deep earth. Sometimes, a more unwelcome aroma joins this subterranean perfume. It might be the acrid bite of blasting powder recently used, or, more subtly, the faint, almost sweetish scent of fire damp methane gas whispering from the coal seams. This is a smell that brings a different kind of chill, a quiet dread, for this invisible guest is a volatile one, a silent threat that dances invisibly around the naked flame of your lamp. This cocktail of dust, damp, and subtle danger is the very atmosphere of your world down here, breathed in, hour after weary hour. And in this world, your eyes, though open, learn a new kind of seeing, or rather, a profound acquaintance with not seeing. The darkness down here isn't like the gentle dark of a moonless night above. No, this is an absolute inky blackness, a solid thing that presses in from all sides, broken only by the tiny, courageous flame you carry, a fragile beacon in an ocean of shadow. At first, perhaps, it's just a tallow candle stuck onto your cap with a lump of wet clay, or perhaps onto a piece of wood driven into a crevice. Its light is a fragile, sputtering thing, casting enormous, distorted shadows that writhe and leap along the rough-hewn walls with every movement. Every swing of your pickaxe makes them dance a frantic, silent jig. The greasy smoke from the tallow stings your eyes, and the slightest draft, a sudden rush of air from a distant passage, threatens to plunge you back into that total, disorienting void. A snuffed candle means fumbling in the pitch black, your hands searching for tinder and spark, a moment of pure, isolated vulnerability amidst the unseen rock. Later, you might graduate to the comparative safety of a Davy lamp, its fine wire gauze cage a marvel of its time, designed to trap the flame and prevent it from igniting the dreaded fire damp. But even this improved light is a muted, almost sullen glow. It carves out a small, personal bubble of visibility, perhaps just enough to illuminate the glistening coalface directly before you, the sheen of sweat on your own forearms, the dull gleam of your tools. Beyond this small circle, the impenetrable blackness waits. Always. It's a constant companion, this deep, silent dark, defining the edges of your perception and perhaps the edges of your hope. And now, with that meager light as your only guide, you must move. The journey to the coalface, or from one seam to another, is rarely a simple walk. The passages ahead are not grand, carved avenues. They are often little more than tight, twisting wounds in the earth, hewn by human hands and sheer will. Imagine shuffling forward, your back constantly bent, the rough, damp rock of the ceiling just inches above your head, sometimes scraping against your hair or the worn fabric of your cap. The texture of the stone is cold, unyielding, a constant, indifferent presence. In many places, even this stooped posture is a luxury. The roof dips lower, the tunnel constricts, and you're forced onto your hands and knees, crawling over uneven ground littered with loose stones and slick patches of mud. Each movement is an effort, a negotiation with the unyielding stone. You can feel the grit embedding itself into the coarse fabric of your clothes, the damp chill seeping into your bones, even through layers. The air here is thick, heavy with the smell of wet earth, coal dust, and the faint metallic tang of unseen minerals. The only sounds might be the scuff of your own passage, the drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling, a constant, monotonous metronome counting out the moments of your shift. Sometimes, the passage might narrow so much you have to turn sideways, your shoulder brushing against one wall, your hip against the other, the rock rough and abrasive against your skin. The light from your lamp throws dancing, distorted shadows, making the already disorienting labyrinth even more confusing, transforming familiar rock formations into fleeting, monstrous shapes. It's a slow, painstaking progress, a constant reminder of your smallness within this vast subterranean world. Each yard gained is a small victory, hard-won against the oppressive darkness and the crushing weight of the earth above. And sometimes, you pause. Perhaps your lamp flickers, demanding a moment's delicate attention, or maybe you've reached a slightly wider space, a brief, precious respite from the claustrophobic press. In these quiet intervals, when the exertion of movement momentarily ceases, the mind truly speaks. It's a language all its own, learned not with words but with a primal, visceral understanding of every creak and groan that echoes through the galleries. Listen closely now, as the air itself seems to carry these subterranean secrets. Far off, muffled by tons of unyielding rock and coal, comes the rhythmic, almost mournful thud of pickaxes. Your comrades unseen, but their efforts felt. It's a ghostly heartbeat, a reminder of other souls toiling in the pervasive blackness. Closer, the wooden support timbers, the pit props, groan under the immense pressure. Each creak is a tense whisper, a story of strain, a subtle, constant warning that the earth is always trying to reclaim these hollowed spaces. Water, too, makes its presence known. It seeps and drips with a relentless, echoing persistence, each drop a tiny, cold clock, ticking away in the damp gloom, pooling on the uneven floor, or running in chilling rivulets down the slick, sweating walls. Then there are the other sounds, or perhaps the unnerving lack of them. An abrupt, profound silence can descend, a silence so complete it feels heavier, more oppressive than the rock itself, pressing in on your eardrums. In these moments, every miner, every child even, holds their breath, ears straining for the slightest indication of what might come next, because silence here is often the deceitful precursor to a more sudden, more violent noise, a sharp crack like splintering bone, a distant, ominous rumble that vibrates through the soles of your worn boots, or the terrifying, sudden rush of shifting earth. These are the sounds that speak most eloquently of danger, the ones that remind you just how fragile your existence is, suspended here between the sunlit surface world and the deep, dark, indifferent unknown. Beyond those sudden, heart-stopping sounds of shifting earth, there was another, more constant companion in the deep. Water, a slow, persistent invader. It was the mine's unwelcome, glistening shadow, a constant, seeping presence. You would often hear it before you saw its dark gleam, the endless, soft, drip, drip, drip echoing in the narrow passages, a kind of morbid, watery metronome, counting out the long seconds of your shift. The rough-hewn walls would glisten with moisture, reflecting the faint flickering light of your candle or oil lamp, like 1,000 tiny, sorrowful eyes. And underfoot, the ground was rarely just solid earth, more often a slick, clinging slurry of mud, rock, and coal dust that would suck at your worn-out boots with every laborious step. Imagine working for hours, sometimes entire shifts, in water that crept above your ankles, even to your knees. A numbing, relentless cold that seeped into your bones no matter how coarse your woolen stockings or how patched your thin trousers. The air itself would feel heavy, thick with dampness, and the distinct, earthy smell of wet rock and mildew, sometimes tinged with the metallic tang of the water itself or the smoky breath of nearby pumps. These pumps, whether great steam-breathing behemoths on the surface or smaller, struggling contraptions deeper within the labyrinth, were the mine's iron heart, their tireless groan and rhythmic clanking a constant, thrumming soundtrack to the toil. They fought a valiant, wheezing battle, drawing the water upwards, but they were fallible, prone to breakdown. When they faltered, or when the heavens opened above, the water would simply rise, a silent, indifferent tide, reclaiming its territory. This was a fight measured not in glorious victories, but in brief, hard-won respites, in just managing to hold the line for another day. Every bucket bailed, every primitive channel cleared, was merely a temporary stay against an enemy that never slept, that simply waited with infinite patience. The water was always there, and it always returned. Beyond the ever-present threat of water, the miner's world was one of intimate, brutal connection with the earth itself. His primary companions in this subterranean existence were not fellow men, though they toiled beside him in the flickering gloom of a candle or the dim glow of a safety lamp, but the tools clutched in his hands. Consider the pickaxe. A simple, almost primitive implement, yet so utterly crucial. Imagine for a moment the worn smoothness of its wooden handle, often damp, polished by countless hours of sweaty, calloused grip, each contour a memory of toil. It would feel heavy, a dead weight at first, but with day-in, day-out use, it became an extension of his arm, of his very will. The sharp, metallic tang of the iron head, often glistening with moisture from the tunnel walls, would fill the close air with each swing, followed by the jarring thud and scrape as it bit into the coal face, a sound that echoed dully in the tight, oppressive confines. Then there was the shovel. Broader, flatter, its blade often dented and scraped, designed not for the initial assault but for clearance. Its handle, too, would bear the same testament to endless labor, perhaps splintered in places, bound with crude wire or a strip of leather. The rhythmic rasp of the shovel, scooping up the loosened rock and coal, the dull clatter as its contents were emptied into a waiting basket or a wheeled quart. These were the percussive notes in the grim symphony of underground labor. These two tools, the pick and the shovel, were far more than just objects. They were the miner's essential interface with the unyielding stone, the crude instruments through which he carved out a meager existence. One painful swing, one laborious scoop at a time. They were, in essence, extensions of his own straining body. Beyond the constant scrape of the shovel and the bite of the pick, there were other tools for the truly stubborn parts of the earth's embrace, for those seams that seemed to mock the miner's initial efforts. When the coal or ore clung too tightly, resisting the sharp point of the pickaxe, it was time for a more direct, more forceful conversation with the stone. This dialogue involved the humble wedge and the mighty sledgehammer. Imagine, if you will, a set of iron wedges, tapered and deceptively simple. The miner, perhaps kneeling or contorted in a narrow passage where the air hung thick and still, would first seek out a weakness. He'd carve a small groove with his pick, or perhaps exploit a natural fissure in the unyielding face of the coal or rock. Then, with the flickering, insufficient light of his lamp casting dancing, unreliable shadows, He would carefully position the sharp end of a wedge into this nascent opening. Then came the sledgehammer, a weighty beast, this tool, with a head of solid iron and a robust wooden handle designed to deliver crushing force. Its use was a brutal ballet of strength and precision. To swing it effectively in such confined spaces, often with a low, damp roof threatening to catch the backswing, required immense power and an almost instinctive accuracy developed over countless painful shifts. Each swing was a commitment, a gamble. A misplaced blow could damage the precious wedge, or worse, send jarring, agonizing pain through already aching limbs. The sound was a dull, resonant worklaker or a sharp clang as metal struck metal, the impact driving the wedge deeper, inch by painstaking inch. You can almost feel the vibration shuddering through the miner's body, the intense strain in his shoulders and back as he heaved the hammer again and again. The rock itself might groan under the pressure. A low, guttural protest, before finally, with a reluctant sharp crack, a section would begin to yield, surrendering its ancient hold. This was not the work of moments, but of sustained, punishing effort, a raw testament to the sheer will required to tear treasure from the earth's deep, dark pockets. But imagine, if you will, a desire for something quicker, a way to shatter the stubborn rock with more immediacy, even if it danced hand in hand with greater danger. This came in the form of gunpowder. Picture the scene, a small hole painstakingly drilled into the rock face, a slow, arduous task in itself. Then, the careful packing of the coarse, dark powder, its gritty texture a promise of violent release. A simple fuse, perhaps a reed filled with a slower burning powder, would be inserted, its end waiting for a spark from a miner's lamp. The air down there, already thick with the scent of damp earth and human exertion, would then carry another, sharper aroma, the acrid, sulphurous tang of the gunpowder itself. Once the fuse was lit, a tiny, sputtering serpent of fire snaking towards its explosive heart, there would be a hurried scramble for what little cover could be found, often just pressing oneself against a distant wall. Then, a sudden, deafening roar, a flash that momentarily blinded even in the gloom, and the violent shudder of the earth beneath your feet, as if the mountain itself were retching. The tunnel would fill instantly with a choking cloud of acrid dust and smoke, the air tasting of grit and burned sulfur, stinging the eyes and lungs. Rocks, large and small, dislodged by the blast would rain down, sometimes with deadly force. It was a brutal, efficient way to tear through the stone, certainly faster than muscle and wedge alone. Yet it was a terrible gamble taken with every single blast, trading painstaking labor for a much more immediate, and often more final, peril. Progress in these deep, dark places often had a steep and very personal cost. In that profound, swallowing darkness that followed an explosion, or indeed that simply forwarded the mine, light was life. Yet, paradoxically, it was also a constant, deadly threat. For the earliest miners, illumination came from the most perilous of sources, the open flame of a tallow candle. Imagine, if you will, holding one aloft. Its weak, sputtering flame, a small, brave orange eye in an ocean of black, would cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock your every hesitant step. The air, already thick with the damp, earthy scent of the pit and the ever-present coal dust, would carry the additional, greasy smell of melting animal fat from your crude light source. This meager illumination, your only guide through the labyrinthine tunnels, your only comfort against the crushing weight of the rock above, was also a potential death sentence, held precariously in your trembling hand. For deep within these seams, unseen and often unsmelled, lurked the mine's invisible assassin. Fire damp, methane gas. A naked flame, even the tiny, innocent-looking flicker of your candle, could meet this lurking menace. The result was often instantaneous and horrific. A sudden, violent roar of fire, an incandescent fist that would punch through the passageways, consuming the very air and everyone in its path. It was a terrible, whispered dread, a constant companion to the back-breaking labor. The search for a safer light was therefore a desperate one, a quiet prayer in the heart of the burgeoning industry. Then, in the early 19th century, a significant glimmer of hope appeared. Sir Humphrey Davy, responding to the appalling accident rates, turned his scientific mind to the problem. His invention, arriving around 1815, was the safety lamp. It was a marvel of simple, elegant physics. A fine wire gauze mesh enclosed the flame. This gauze, crucially, would cool the flame's heat, preventing it from igniting any methane outside the lamp. The flame inside might elongate or change color if high concentrations of gas were present, transforming it from an ignition source into a warning. It wasn't a perfect solution. The light was still dim. But it was a profound revolution, one less demon to battle in the oppressive, silent dark. So, with a slightly less treacherous flame flickering, casting its weak glow on the glistening coal face, the next monumental task began. The freshly hewn rock, heavy and unforgiving, wouldn't simply walk itself out of the labyrinthine darkness. For what must have felt like an eternity to those toiling below, moving this bounty was a feat of raw human endurance. Imagine, if you will, the immense strain. Heavy wicker baskets, filled to bursting, were dragged by hand, their rough bottoms scraping noisily against the uneven, often wet tunnel floors. Or perhaps a wooden sledge, the Corf, laden with hundreds of pounds of coal, its runners groaning under the weight as a miner strained in the near-total blackness, muscles screaming with the effort. Then, a small step forward, an echo of the railways beginning to crisscross the world above. Small tubs, like miniature wagons, were introduced, running on crude iron or wooden rails laid precariously along the tunnel floor. This made the load a little easier to shift, the clatter of iron wheels a new, rhythmic, metallic sound in the oppressive silence. But who, you might wonder, provided the motive power for these advancing tubs? Often it was the smallest of shoulders. Children, some heartbreakingly young, were tasked as hurriers, harnessed like little beasts of burden, crawling on all fours in the narrowest seams, pulling these heavy tubs. Sometimes, small, sturdy ponies, their coats matted with dust and sweat, shared this grim toil, their hooves skittering on the unfamiliar rails, their breath misting in the cool, damp air. It was a slow, aching journey, inch by inch, ton by ton, from the deep earth towards the distant promise of daylight. But where did this mountain of black stone originate? Deeper still, at the very end of these suffocating tunnels, lay the coalface. And here, the specialist of this subterranean world, the hewer, plied his trade, often in conditions almost too bleak to truly imagine. Imagine, for a moment, you are that hewer. The space you occupy is often no taller than a low table, so cramped you can barely stretch. Your only light, a flickering, sputtering flame from a safety lamp, casting dancing, elongated shadows that writhe on the rough-hewn walls, barely illuminating the glistening blackness of the coal seam before you. The air is thick with coal dust, a gritty powder that coats every surface, fills your lungs with each shallow breath and stings your eyes, mingling with the ever-present smell of damp earth and stale sweat. Lying on your side, perhaps in a puddle of chill water, or contorted into an unnatural, muscle-screaming position, you swing your heavy pickaxe with a practiced rhythmic grunt. Each thudding strike against the stubborn seam dislodges chunks of coal, the precious black diamonds that cascade around you. The only sounds, apart from your own ragged breathing and the rhythmic chip-chip-chipping, might be the groan of timber supports protesting under the immense weight of the earth above, or the distant, constant drip-drip-drip of water seeping through the rock. This was a brutal, relentless ballet of muscle and metal. Hour after hour, the hewer would chip away, his body aching, his hands raw and calloused, carving out the fuel that powered a revolution happening in a world of sunlight he might rarely see. There was a grim skill to it, an intimate knowledge of the rock, knowing just where to strike to coax the coal free, all while acutely aware of the ever-present danger of a sudden collapse, a pocket of deadly gas. He was the unseen foundation of an industrial age, his life etched in sweat and shadow. Once the hewer had wrested the coal from the earth's grip, another crucial figure stepped into this dim, damp narrative. Imagine now the haulier, or the putter, as they were often called, often a youth, sometimes barely into his teens, though frequently a stronger young man, whose muscles were still hardening into the unforgiving shape of mining life. His task was relentless: to move the heavy, laden tubs of coal, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, from the distant coal face to the main shaft, a repetitive, aching journey through the labyrinthine tunnels. Picture the scene: the air thick with coal dust, clinging to his sweat-soaked skin and rough-spun clothes. The only light perhaps a flickering, greasy candle or a dim safety lamp casting long, dancing shadows that writhed on the tunnel walls. The pathways were rarely even, often so low and uneven they forced him to stoop, sometimes to crawl on hands and knees, his young body contorted as he pushed or pulled the heavy corf. These tubs, often on crude wooden or early iron rails if he was fortunate, but sometimes just dragged along a rough, muddy track, seemed to grow heavier with each passing, gas-lit hour. The rhythmic, often painful groan of the tub's wheels, the metallic scrape against stone, or the sucking squelch of boots in the ever-present dampness and filth. These were the dominant sounds of his working day, a grim symphony of relentless strain. Each journey, repeated countless times in the suffocating blackness, was a testament to youthful strength, slowly, inevitably, being spent in the service of the hungry furnaces and burgeoning industries above. He wasn't just moving coal. He was a vital, straining link in a human chain forged in darkness, each link bearing an immense, often unseen burden for a sunlit world he barely knew. But even younger souls toiled in that oppressive gloom, fulfilling roles that demanded not strength, but an almost unbearable stillness. Imagine, if you will, being a trapper. You are perhaps 5, maybe 6 years old, stationed alone in the pitch black for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. Your sole responsibility is a heavy wooden door, a crucial part of the mine's ventilation system, keeping dangerous gases from building up and fresh air flowing to the coalface. You sit on the cold, damp earth, a small, solitary figure. Perhaps you have a stub of a candle, its weak flame casting, dancing, monstrous shadows on the rough-hewn walls, its tallow scent mingling with the ever-present odor of damp coal dust and something vaguely metallic. More often, you have nothing but the profound, enveloping darkness. The silence is vast, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water seeping through the rock, or the far-off, ghostly rumble of a coal tub approaching. Your tiny hands, raw from the rough wood, grip the string to pull the door open, then close it tight once the tub has passed. What thoughts might drift through a child's mind in such profound isolation? The fear of the dark, certainly, and the unseen things it might hold. The crushing boredom, the longing for sunlight, or the simple comfort of another human voice. Each creak of the timbers, each rustle in the unseen corners, could be anything. This wasn't just a job, it was an endurance, a childhood spent waiting in the dark, a tiny, crucial cog in a vast, indifferent machine. The weight of that door was nothing compared to the weight of the hours. While some, like those young trappers, endured the crushing darkness below, the surface of the colliery was a world of its own relentless toil, open to the elements yet no less demanding. Here, under an often gray and smoky sky, worked the pit-brow lasses. These women and older girls, their faces and hands inevitably smudged with the same persistent coal dust that coated everything, performed grueling physical labor. Picture them beside the heaps of newly mined coal, the air filled with the constant, almost deafening clatter as tubs were emptied, the rhythmic scrape of their shovels against stone, the sharp grating sound of coal being sorted by hand. They stood for long hours, sometimes in the bone-chilling winds of winter or the drenching, inescapable rain, their fingers, often chapped and raw even through rough gloves, tirelessly sifting through the black harvest, separating valuable fuel from rock and debris. Their attire was purely practical, a subject of much debate and sometimes scandal in Victorian society. Thick trousers, often worn beneath heavy aprons or skirts, sturdy boots caked with mud, and simple headscarves to try and keep the worst of the ever-present dust from their hair. This was a uniform born of harsh necessity, not fleeting fashion, yet it drew disapproving gazes and stern moral judgment from those who felt a woman's place was far removed from such grimy, seemingly, unfeminine work. But the hungry furnaces of industry cared little for propriety. the mines needed every able hand. These women were strong, their contribution undeniable, even as the sharp, earthy smell of coal and damp soil clung to their clothes and skin, a constant reminder of their arduous day. The air itself, thick with that same clinging scent of coal and damp earth, was a shared burden for everyone who descended into the blackness. And, watching over them, a figure as much a part of this subterranean world as the coal seams themselves, was the overman, or deputy as he was sometimes known. He was the eyes and ears of the mine management deep underground, tasked with the dual, often contradictory, goals of ensuring both safety and relentless output. His lamp, perhaps a little brighter, a little cleaner than the others, would cut through the oppressive gloom as he made his rounds, its flickering light a small beacon in the endless dark. This overman was frequently a man who had risen from the ranks, a miner who had somehow survived years at the coalface, his body often bearing the quiet testimony of past near misses or minor injuries. He knew the creaks and groans of the timber supports, the telltale metallic scent of dangerous fire damp, the subtle shifts in the rock that might whisper of an impending collapse. He'd felt the sharp sting of coal dust in his own lungs, the weary ache in his own back after a long shift chipping away at the unyielding stone. This intimate, hard-won knowledge made him a figure of both respect and, at times, quiet apprehension. His word could mean the difference between a relatively safe passage and a perilous one, or between a full tally of tubs and a reduced one, affecting the meager earnings of every worker. He walked a constant, precarious tightrope. The pressure from above, from owners often far removed from the damp, dangerous realities of the pit, was for more coal, always more, to feed the insatiable hunger of the factories and furnaces. Yet he was also responsible for the lives of the men, women, and children under his watch in that dark labyrinth. A rockfall, an explosion of gas, a sudden inundation of water. These were not abstract fears, but vivid memories or ever-present possibilities he carried with him, etched into his mind alongside the mental maps of the sprawling tunnels. His gruff voice, echoing in the narrow, damp passages, might deliver an order for more props to secure a crumbling roof, or a terse warning about a pocket of gas, or perhaps just the grim, weary news that another ton of coal was demanded before the shift's draining end. And amidst this human toil, this constant dance with danger, were other, quieter workers, their contribution often overlooked in the grand narratives of industrial might. The pit ponies, and sometimes larger stoic horses, were the unsung engines of these subterranean worlds. Imagine, if you will, a sturdy little pony, perhaps no taller than your waist, its breath misting in the cool, damp air that always seemed to carry a chill. Its hooves, carefully shod, would clatter softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant clang of pickaxes on the uneven, often slick track. They rarely, if ever, saw the sun, these creatures. Many were born into or brought young into the Stygian gloom, their eyes adapting to a world of perpetual twilight. Their entire existence was illuminated only by the flickering, weak light of the miners' lamps. Those tiny, precious flames casting long, dancing shadows that made even the familiar tunnels seem alien and sometimes menacing. They hauled the heavy tubs of coal, day after day, their muscles straining, their coats often matted with grime, sweat, and the ever-present coal dust. The air they breathed was thick with it, the same acrid dust that settled in the miners' lungs, mingled with the scent of damp earth, stale water, and the faint metallic tang of the minerals themselves. A kind word, a rough pat on the neck, a shared crust of bread, these were the small kindnesses in a life of relentless labor. They knew the labyrinthine paths as well as any man, responding to gentle tugs on the reins, to familiar voices, a silent, trusting understanding passing between beast and handler. To think of them, living their entire lives in such confinement, their patient, steady work a constant in the dark, it's a poignant image, isn't it? These loyal animals, sharing the risks, sharing the gloom, their quiet, stoic presence, a somber, furry note in the symphony of the mine. That poignant image of the ponies, their lives spent in shadow, lingers, doesn't it? But alongside them, human lives too were measured in degrees of darkness, in shifts that stretched into an eternity of labor. Picture it, if you will, not just the absence of daylight, but 10 or 12, sometimes even 14 relentless hours of unceasing toil. The sun would rise, trace its arc across the sky, and begin its descent, all entirely unseen, a distant rumor in a world defined by the damp chill of the earth and the flickering, unreliable light of a tallow candle or a smoky oil lamp. Time down there, it must have moved differently, each minute stretching, elastic, and heavy. Each swing of the pickaxe, each shovelful of coal heaved into a waiting corf, wasn't just a task, but a tiny, aching fragment of an immense, almost incomprehensible span of effort. There were no gentle chimes of a village clock tower to mark the passing hours. Only the rhythmic, metallic clang of tools against stone, the distant, mournful rumble of coal wagons on their tracks, the incessant drip, drip, drip of water seeping through rock, and the ever-present, ominous creak of timbers straining under the weight of the world above. A brief, hurried gulp of tepid water, a desperate gnaw at a piece of stale bread clutched in a grimy, calloused hand. These were often the only punctuation marks in a sentence of labor that seemed to have no end, just a slow, grinding continuation. What did the body even feel after such a stretch, before the long trudge home? The brief respite, if it could even be called that, would evaporate like mist against the oppressive heat of your own exertion. Now, back to the coal face, a dark, glistening wall in the faint, flickering dance of your lamp. Here, the real artistry of extraction began, a brutal ballet performed in the black. First came the undercutting, or, quote, holing. You'd lie on your side, often in inches of cold, gritty water that seeped relentlessly into your worn clothes. Your pickaxe an extension of your aching arm. With small, precise, yet powerful strokes, you'd chip away at the base of the seam, creating a deep horizontal slot. The air, already heavy, would thicken further with dust, a gritty film coating your tongue, your lungs. Above you, the immense weight of the earth felt palpable, held back by straining timbers and, it often seemed, sheer hope. Once the cut was deep enough, the hewing began. This was the moment of truth, bringing the precious, stubborn coal down. Perhaps you'd use iron wedges, hammering them into the top of the undercut section, listening for the telltale groan as the black diamonds prepared to surrender to gravity. Or maybe it was just sheer, relentless pickaxe work, chipping and prying, the rhythmic thud and scrape echoing in the oppressive silence, broken only by your own ragged breath and the occasional scuttle of unseen things in the dark. Each swing was a gamble, a silent prayer that only the coal and not the unforgiving roof would fall. Then, the loading. In a space barely tall enough to kneel, sometimes even less, you'd wrestle the heavy, jagged lumps of coal, each one a dead weight, a fragment of ancient sunlight, promising a moment's warmth for someone else, far away, into the waiting tub, or corf. Your muscles would scream in protest, your back would feel as though it might snap with each lift. Shoveling, lifting, pushing, the rough edges of the coal scraped against your already raw skin. The air, thick with fine, choking dust, tasted of earth, sweat, and exhaustion. Each filled tub was a tiny victory, a fraction of the day's demand, before the whole exhausting cycle began anew on the next section of the seam. And so the days, the weeks, the years would unspool in this dim, subterranean world. The repetition wasn't just of tasks, but of strain, a constant grinding wear on your very frame. Imagine yourself, perhaps, in a seam so low you couldn't even kneel, but had to lie on your side, your body contorted for hours, one arm swinging the pick in a painfully restricted arc. The muscles in your shoulder and neck would burn, then go numb, then burn again, a dull, throbbing ache that became your constant companion, a shadow clinging to every waking moment. Your joints. Oh, your poor joints. Knees, elbows, wrists, hips. They'd creak and groan like the pit props around you, swelling with inflammation. Each movement a reminder of the unnatural positions forced upon them, slowly deforming them over time. The repetitive strain injuries we understand today were simply the miner's lot. An accepted, agonizing part of earning a meager wage. Every twist, every lift, every strained reach etched itself into your bones, shaping your very posture into a permanent stoop, aging you far beyond your years. And all the while, that insidious dust, finer than flour, was settling deep within your lungs, a slow, suffocating blanket that would eventually steal your breath for good. The air itself was an enemy, unseen but ever present, contributing to the chronic cough that echoed through the narrow tunnels, a rattling, wheezing chorus of human endurance pushed to its absolute limit. The physical toll was immense, a constant ache in your muscles, a fire in your lungs, but the way you were paid added another layer of relentless, quiet pressure, a vice tightening with every passing hour. It wasn't enough to simply endure the darkness and the danger. Your earnings, the very bread on your family's table, depended entirely on the sheer volume of coal you could wrestle from the unyielding earth. This was the unsparing logic of quote-quote piecework. Each swing of the pick, each laden basket, each gritty shovelful of rock and precious black mineral was a tiny, hard-won fraction of your wage. There was no hourly rate to offer a safety net, no comfort in knowing that just being present, just breathing that foul air, meant something tangible. If the coal seam proved stubborn, a geological lottery you couldn't win, or your tools blunted to uselessness, or your strength simply, inevitably waned, your pay packet shrunk accordingly, a stark, silent judgment. This system, as you can imagine, bred a desperate, often reckless haste. You might find yourself taking shortcuts, a hurried, ill-considered decision in the dim light. Perhaps not setting a vital timber support quite as securely as your gut told you, because every moment spent on painstaking safety was a moment not spent hewing coal. The echo of your pickaxe against the coal face would become a frantic, almost panicked rhythm, driven by the gnawing fear of not producing enough, of facing your loved ones empty-handed. Imagine that feeling, deep down in the oppressive, clammy darkness. The air thick with choking dust and the distant, ominous groans of the earth settling around you, knowing that every lump of coal was a coin, and every pause, every gasp for breath, a potential hunger pang for your children. It was a cruel, unforgiving calculus, weighing your immediate fleeting safety against the constant, pressing need to earn, to simply survive. And then, after what felt like an eternity of that relentless toil, a brief, almost begrudged pause might be permitted. A signal, perhaps a shout echoing faintly down the tunnel, would allow you to momentarily lower your heavy pickaxe. You wouldn't move far. There was nowhere to go, really. You'd simply slump against a damp, cold rock face, the rough stone pressing into your weary back, a momentary change from the strain of swinging and hauling. Now for your meal. Forget any notions of a warm, comforting spread. You'd fumble in a grimy pocket, fingers stiff and caked with coal dust, for the small, precious bundle. It might be a hunk of coarse bread, perhaps a little dry, maybe with a sliver of hard cheese if your family could afford it that week. Imagine unwrapping it, the faint, earthy smell of the bread mixing with the ever-present metallic tang of the mine and the dampness in the air. You'd eat this in near total darkness, the feeble glow from your Davy lamp casting just enough light to see the ghostly outline of your own hands, your own meager portion. Each bite would be heavy, not just with its own substance, but with the taste of the mine itself. A gritty film of dust coating everything, even your tongue. The water dripping from the ceiling, a constant, monotonous percussion, might be your only drink, collected in a cupped hand or a rusty tin. A few stolen moments of quiet chewing, the silence only broken by the drip, 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 and the distant creaks of the mines settling, before the call to return to the coal face would inevitably come. But the dust and the darkness, the relentless ache in your muscles, these were the known adversaries. Lurking in the stale air, unseen and often unsmelt, were far more insidious foes. These were the whispers of the deep earth, the gaseous specters that could snuff out a life, or many lives, in a horrifying instant. They had names, of course, names born of bitter experience: fire damp and choke damp. Fire damp, mostly methane, was the explosive one. It would seep silently from the coal seams, tasteless, odorless in its purest form, yet sometimes carrying a faint garlic-like scent from other compounds mixed within it. It was lighter than air, so it would gather near the roof, an invisible, volatile cloud waiting for just one spark. A carelessly swung pickaxe striking stone, a faulty lamp, and the mine would roar, a sudden, blinding flash of orange heat consuming everything and everyone in its path. The sheer concussive force could collapse tunnels. The aftermath, a scene of unimaginable devastation and grief. Then there was choke damp, a heavy, suffocating blanket primarily of carbon dioxide or nitrogen, sometimes called, quote, black damp. Unlike its fiery cousin, choke damp didn't explode. It simply stole the air from your lungs. It would pool in the low-lying areas, invisible, often displacing the vital oxygen. A miner venturing into such a pocket might feel a sudden weakness, a dizzying lightness in the head, their lamp flame dwindling to a pale, ghostly blue or extinguishing altogether. Unchecked, it was a quiet, creeping death, a slow fade into unconsciousness, often mistaken for simple exhaustion until it was far too late. But while choke damp offered a quiet, insidious end, its counterpart, fire damp, announced its presence with terrifying violence. This was methane, the dreaded fire damp, a gas lighter than air, seeping silently from the coal seams to gather in pockets near the roof, an invisible, highly flammable cloud just waiting. Waiting for what? Often, it was the very thing miners carried to see, the naked flame of their candle or oil lamp, a tiny flicker of light in an ocean of darkness, holding the power of catastrophic detonation. Imagine the scene, if you can bear it, for a moment. The usual subterranean symphony of the mine. The distant rhythmic clang of pickaxes against stubborn coal. The low rumble of laden carts on uneven tracks. The constant, monotonous drip of water echoing in the oppressive, cool, dark. Then, a tiny, almost insignificant spark. Perhaps a miner, weary from hours of back-breaking labor, his senses dulled by the unchanging gloom, raised his lamp just a fraction too high. In that single fatal instant, the air itself would ignite. A sudden, deafening roar, a monstrous exhalation from the very bowels of the earth, and a flash of searing blue-white light that would momentarily obliterate the darkness, and likely blind anyone unfortunate enough to witness it directly. The force was unimaginable, a solid fist of pressure that could throw grown men like ragdolls, pulverize sturdy timber supports as if they were matchsticks, and send tons of rock and debris crashing down into the narrow roadways. Those directly in its path stood no chance, consumed by the intense fire or crushed in an instant. The shockwave, a violent ripple of destruction, would race through the labyrinthine tunnels, often triggering devastating secondary explosions as it ignited the fine coal dust hanging thick and ever-present in the air, amplifying the devastation exponentially. What followed was a hellish aftermath. Choking, acrid dust filling every passage, the sharp smell of burnt earth, and something cloyingly, sickeningly sweet. And then, often, a profound, terrible silence, broken only by the distant groans of the dying or the frantic, hopeless shouts of survivors lost in the impenetrable, suffocating blackness. But even if the fiery breath of an explosion spared you, the mountain itself remained a restless, heavy beast. In that profound quiet following a blast, or just during the deceptive calm of an ordinary shift, the earth above you whispered its intentions. You might hear it first as a soft sigh, a trickle of dust from the ceiling, a fine powder dusting your shoulders in the faint lamplight. The timber props, those strained wooden soldiers holding back tons of rock and soil, would groan under the immense, unseen pressure, their woody fibers creaking like an old ship in a storm. Experienced miners learned to listen to these subtle confessions of the rock, their ears perpetually strained, tuned to the faintest shifts in the language of impending doom. Every creak of wood, every pebble that skittered loose, was a potential death sentence whispered from the darkness. A sudden sharp crack, distinct above the damp dripping and the distant echoes of work, a spatter of small stones, and the air itself would seem to grow heavier, more oppressive. There was often no grand warning, no time to scramble for safety, just the brutal immediacy of the mountain reclaiming its own. One moment, the rhythmic clang of pickaxes, the murmur of distant voices. The next, a deafening, thunderous roar as the roof gave way. A cascade of rock and earth, a monstrous wave of solid darkness, would obliterate the passage. For those caught beneath, there was no escape, only the crushing weight, the sudden, final blackness. The tunnel, their place of work, their meager livelihood, became their tomb, instantly. Imagine the cold, jagged rock pressing in. The air forced from your lungs, the chilling silence that would descend once the earth settled. Now, a heavy, unyielding blanket. It was a swift, brutal end, a constant, silent lottery played out in the deep, dark heart of the earth, a gamble taken with every swing of the pick. And if the solid earth didn't claim you, the water often tried. It was a different kind of threat, insidious and relentless, a liquid menace that lurked just beyond the rough-hewn walls of your narrow world. Deep within the earth, unseen rivers and vast, hidden reservoirs waited, pressing against the thin boundaries of human endeavor. Sometimes, a misplaced swing of a pickaxe, a deeper-than-usual blast, would be all it took. A small crack, a fissure, and then the water would begin its silent, deadly invasion. Imagine that moment. Perhaps a low, distant rumble, almost dismissed as the earth settling, but then it grows, a hollow sound that chills you to the bone. A trickle of cold water seeping from a rock face becomes a gush, then a roaring torrent, black and icy, surging through the narrow passages. The air, already thick with coal dust and the scent of human toil, would suddenly carry the raw chill of the deep earth's veins, a damp, metallic tang. Your lamp's feeble flame would dance wildly on the rising dark surface, reflecting the desperate scramble as escape routes vanished, one by one, under the churning flow. To be caught by the flood was a terrifying prospect. The water would push and pull, its icy grip dragging at your clothes, your heavy boots feeling like anchors. You might scramble for higher ground, a precarious ledge, listening to the relentless gurgle and roar below, the shouts of others echoing, and then, perhaps, fading into the overwhelming noise of the deluge. Or you'd be swept away, tumbling in the cold, dark current, the tunnel transforming from a place of work into a rushing, watery grave. Escape, a rapidly dimming hope in the suffocating blackness, as the unseen tide claimed yet another life. But even if you survived the sudden terror of a flood, or the shattering violence of an explosion, another, quieter enemy was always there, sharing your every breath, settling into the very fabric of your being. It was the dust. Coal dust, fine as powdered night, a constant insidious companion in the narrow, lamplit spaces. It settled on your skin, gritty and unwelcome. A second, shadowy layer you could never quite scrub away. It caked your hair, stiff and black, lined your nostrils, and dusted your meager piece of bread if you were lucky enough to have one, tainting its taste with the earth's bitter harvest. You'd breathe it in with every gasp for air in the thin, stale atmosphere of the deep tunnels, a relentless, invisible rain. At first, perhaps just a tickle in the throat, a cough you'd try to stifle, dismissing it as part of the job. But this dust wasn't like the harmless motes dancing in a sunbeam. This was sharp, aggressive, each particle a tiny shard, and it began to build, unseen within your lungs. A thick, dark blanket slowly, relentlessly smothering the delicate pink tissues from the inside, turning them as black as the coal itself. Day by day, year by year, the simple act of drawing breath would become a conscious effort, then a painful labor. The cough would deepen, becoming a harsh, rattling sound that echoed the mind's own groans, a sound all too familiar in the cramped cottages above ground. Your chest would feel perpetually tight, as if bound by iron bands, each inhalation a shallow victory. This was the black lung, the miner's phesis, a slow, suffocating march towards an early grave, often before you even saw middle age. There were no dramatic collapses, no sudden cries of alarm for this particular killer. Just a gradual fading, a life choked out by the very substance that provided a meager, dangerous living. A cruel irony, whispered on every wheezing breath, in every shadowed home. Beyond the slow, insidious creep of disease that tightened your chest, other, more immediate specters of danger haunted the mechanical heart of the mine. Each journey into the earth or back to the surface was an act of fragile trust placed in the groaning, shuddering, winding gear. You might stand there, shoulder to shoulder with fellow miners in that crude metal cage, feeling the unnerving judder as it began its descent into the Stygian blackness, or the equally unsteady, hopeful pull as it eventually brought you, weary and coated in grime, back towards the faint, distant promise of daylight. The thick, tarred ropes, that single thread connecting you to the world above, were under constant, immense strain. The thought of one fraying, snapping, was a cold, persistent dread that settled deep in the pit of every miner's stomach. A sudden, gut-wrenching lurch, a scream, swallowed by the echoing shaft. These were not just whispered fears, but grim realities recounted in hushed tones. Then there were the tubs, those heavy iron carts, often overladen with coal, trundling along narrow, uneven tracks. On any incline, a carelessly secured coupling or a worn-out chain could fail, sending a tub careening back down the slope, an unstoppable, rumbling juggernaut in the confined, lamp-lit tunnels. There was rarely much warning, perhaps a distant sharp crack, followed by the rapidly intensifying roar of metal grinding against metal, a sound that promised collision and chaos. The lucky ones might hear it in time to flatten themselves against a damp wall, or scramble into a shallow manhole. The unlucky, well, the mine had a brutally efficient way of claiming its due. These weren't gentle departures from life, they were stark, violent interruptions. A grim lottery played out daily in the echoing, unforgiving darkness, leaving behind not just sorrow, but often terrible, mangling injuries. Even if a miner managed to sidestep the sudden violent calamities, the shattering cave-ins, the terrifying runaway trams, another more patient adversary lurked in the stale, heavy air of the deep. It was the dust. A constant, almost living presence. This wasn't just ordinary dust. It was a fine, gritty powder of coal, rock, and sometimes silica, kicked up with every swing of a pick, every shovel load, every weary exhalation. It settled like a black shroud over everything. The damp, glistening tunnel walls, the meager light of their flickering lamps, their rough-spun clothes, their exposed skin. You would feel it clinging to your eyelashes, taste its bitterness on your tongue, and feel it, a gritty invasion, with every breath taken in those suffocating confines. Day after relentless day, this fine, abrasive dust found its way deeper into the lungs. And so, inevitably for many, the miner's cough would begin. This wasn't a simple cough, the kind that clears a tickle in the throat. No, this was a harsh, tearing, rattling sound that seemed to come from the very depths of a man's being, a desperate attempt to expel what could not be expelled. It was often a wet, productive cough, sometimes bringing up black sputum, a grim, visual testament to the battle raging within the chest. This wasn't a temporary ailment. It was a grim signature tune of the trade, the audible evidence of lungs slowly, painfully scarring and hardening, a condition we now know as pneumoconiosis, or more starkly, black lung. The sound would echo through the cramped, smoky confines of the pit, and later haunt the small, sparsely furnished cottages above ground, a constant, hacking reminder of the mine's relentless claim on its workers. It was the sound of a life being slowly, inexorably traded for the black diamonds that powered an empire. That hacking cough, the mine's grim signature tune, often didn't get to play out its full, agonizing symphony. For so many who descended into the earth each day, life was a tragically brief candle, easily snuffed out. It wasn't uncommon for a man to be considered old in his 30s, his body already hunched and worn by the relentless toil, a shadow of the youth he'd carried into the pit only a decade or two before. Imagine the constant gnawing anxiety, a cold companion in the oppressive dark. The creak and groan of timber supports, always a whisper away from a sudden, crushing silence as tons of rock and earth surrendered to gravity. Or the invisible menace of methane, fire damp as they called it, tasteless, odorless, waiting for a single spark from a pickaxe or a poorly maintained lamp to erupt into a devastating torrent of flame and force. The air, thick with coal dust, would then carry the muffled cries, or worse, the profound, echoing stillness that followed an explosion or collapse. These weren't distant possibilities, they were the chillingly familiar risks of every single shift. And even if a miner managed to dodge these sudden, violent ends, the sheer physical exertion, day after punishing day, twisted spines and wore-down joints to aching remnants. The damp chill of the tunnels seeped deep into bones, a relentless cold that no hearth could fully dispel, and poor nutrition offered little strength for repair or resistance. All this conspired to weaken the body, making it a welcoming host for any passing sickness. A simple cough, not from dust but from infection, could quickly turn fatal for a system already under siege. The mine, it seemed, always collected its due, one way or another, leaving behind young widows and fatherless children. A quiet, pervasive sorrow, seeping through the mining communities like the ever-present, clinging damp. It was a heavy price for the fuel of an empire, paid in breaths cut short, and futures erased in the deep, unforgiving dark. And for all this sacrifice, for these shortened lives and bodies broken by the relentless toil, what was the reward? The coin that found its way into a miner's calloused, coal-stained hand at the week's end was often shockingly slight, a cruel joke played in the flickering lamplight. Barely enough sometimes to quiet the persistent rumble of hungry bellies in the cramped, damp cottage that passed for home, where the scent of coal dust mingled with the smell of boiling potatoes if they were lucky. Imagine the scene. The air still thick with the earthy tang of the mine, and the metallic scent of sweat clinging to your worn, rough-spun clothes, and the sum you hold feels impossibly small, a pittance against the towering mountain of need. These wages, earned in the very bowels of the earth, wrested from rock and darkness to fuel the grand engines of industry, rarely offered a path out of hardship. Instead, they often tethered families to a relentless, grinding cycle of poverty. Perhaps a portion of that meager pay never even felt like your own. A ghostly deduction for blasting powder, for the sharpening of tools, or for suspiciously priced flour and bacon at a store you had little practical choice but to frequent. Each penny was stretched, then stretched again, a constant wearying calculation performed by tired minds against the backdrop of ever-present risk. The dream of a little comfort, a warm fire without worry, a moment's true respite, remained just that for so many. A dream, as elusive as clean air in the depths of the pit, or a future free from the looming shadow of debt. And yet, amidst that clinging coal dust and the gnawing worry of debt, a different kind of wealth, a different kind of warmth, did manage to take root. It wasn't found in the meager pay packets, nor in the damp, cramped cottages that leaned against each other as if for support. No, this quiet strength bloomed in the spaces between people. The shared glances of understanding between mothers as they hung out patched-up washing, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and cheap soap, the knowing nod from an older miner to a young lad just starting his shifts, a silent promise of guidance in the suffocating dark. Imagine for a moment the soundscape of such a village after the day's shift. Not just the clatter of returning clogs on cobblestones, or the weary coughs echoing from doorways, but perhaps the distant strains of a song carried on the evening breeze from a neighbor's open window, a melody shared by voices that knew the same fears and the same small hopes. These were communities where everyone understood the tremor in the ground, the significance of a particular whistle, the unspoken dread that accompanied a delayed return from the pit. This shared knowledge, this collective breath held and released, bound them tighter than any contract. If a family faced sickness, or the unthinkable loss that haunted every household, doors weren't locked. Instead, a bowl of thin stew might appear, offered with a quiet word. A child might be taken in for a few hours, their laughter a brief, bright counterpoint to the sorrow. A few precious pennies, painstakingly saved, might be pooled to help a neighbor through the bleakest times. This wasn't charity as we might think of it, not some grand gesture. It was survival, woven into the very fabric of their days. It was the grim, unspoken pact of those who descended into the earth together, and whose families waited, together, above. This fierce, fragile solidarity, It was their truest, most vital currency. And within that tight-knit world, beneath the shared burdens and the quiet acts of kindness, pulsed an even deeper, more personal current. The fierce, unspoken hope for the children. Each swing of the pickaxe, each aching muscle, was perhaps fueled by a silent prayer that their sons and daughters, too, might never know the chilling descent in a rattling cage, never feel the suffocating darkness of the earth's deep places press in around them. Imagine, for a moment, a father, his face permanently etched with coal dust, his knuckles raw and calloused. He looks at his young son's hands, still small, still relatively unblemished, and dreams, not of grand estates or untold riches, but simply of a life where the son is a daily companion, not a fleeting acquaintance at the beginning and end of an exhausting shift underground. He might picture his boy as a clerk, perhaps, the air around him smelling of ink and paper, a stark contrast to the ever-present odor of damp earth, stale air, and coal. Or maybe a shopkeeper, the gentle clinking of coins a far cry from the distant, ominous groan of the pit props. These weren't extravagant ambitions, not really. They were desperate, whispered yearnings for an escape route, a small, sunlit exit from the seemingly predestined path into the pit. A future where fresh air wasn't a commodity, and daylight wasn't a carefully rationed treasure. But the hard truth, as unyielding as the coal face itself, was that opportunities were heartbreakingly scarce. Education was a flickering lamp in a drafty room, easily extinguished by the demands of poverty. Apprenticeships were few, and often just another form of demanding, poorly paid labor. The deafening roar of the factory looms, the relentless toil of the agricultural fields. Each alternative often seemed merely a different flavor of hardship. So that powerful, driving hope, it frequently remained just that, a quiet prayer against the relentless clang of machinery and the deep rumble of coal carts. A fragile, precious dream, clutched tightly in the oppressive darkness, a testament to a profound love that yearned for a brighter sky for the next generation, even when the clouds of grim reality hung so very, very low. And yet, even in that deepest, most suffocating darkness, where hope felt like a distant, flickering candle, tiny sparks of a different kind began to glow. Whispers at first, furtive and fearful. Imagine, if you will, the scene. Perhaps in the grimy, shadowed corner of a dimly lit public house, over a lukewarm, watery ale that did little to wash away the coal dust still clinging to their throats. The steam from damp, rough-spun wool coats would mingle with the acrid scent of cheap pipe tobacco and the ever-present human smells of sweat and weariness. Or maybe these hushed conversations took place even deeper, in the damp, echoing galleries of the mine itself, after the overseer's flickering lamp had finally receded into the distance, leaving them in an almost complete blackness, save for their own sputtering tallow candles. Voices would be kept deliberately low, a cautious rumble against the constant rhythmic drip of water from the stone roof, and the distant, unsettling groan of the earth settling around them. These weren't grand pronouncements, not yet. There were no polished speeches, no printed pamphlets in these earliest days. They were the tentative murmurings of shared suffering, the slow, hesitant dawning that perhaps, just perhaps, the relentless, bone-jarring grind wasn't an unchangeable law of nature, dictated from on high. Imagine the quiet, desperate courage it took, the simple, almost reckless act of speaking up, when silence was the only proven path to continued, albeit miserable, survival. To suggest that a life shouldn't be so cheaply spent in the pursuit of profit for others, that a man deserved to see the sun without his lungs already thick and heavy with dust. They talked of shillings and pence, of course. But woven through those conversations were pleas for props that wouldn't splinter and buckle under pressure, for air that didn't sting the eyes and choke the breath, for just a fighting chance to grow old enough to see their own children grow. It was a fragile, almost foolhardy defiance, a collective breath held against the immense, crushing weight of the entire industrial system. A tiny seed of monumental change planted in the most hostile, unyielding soil imaginable. That seed, planted in the dark and damp, did not sprout quickly, nor did it bloom with any sudden burst of sunlight. Change, when it came to the mines, was a slow, grudging creep, often bought at a terrible price. Imagine the hushed whispers after a rockfall, the grim counting of heads, the families waiting at the pit mouth, their hope dwindling with each passing hour. It was these moments, these heart-wrenching disasters, where the earth swallowed dozens, sometimes hundreds, that finally pricked the conscience of those above ground, or perhaps, more cynically, threatened profits enough to warrant attention. Each catastrophe became a grim lesson, etched in soot and sorrow. A fire-damp explosion, that terrifying invisible breath of the mine igniting with a roar, might eventually lead to slightly better ventilation, or the cautious, tentative introduction of safety lamps. Think of Humphrey Davy, tinkering away, trying to create a light that wouldn't betray the men who carried it into gas-filled seams. His lamp and others like it weren't perfect, and they arrived agonizingly slowly, but they represented a flicker of progress in the oppressive gloom, a small shield against a constant unseen enemy. Slowly, painstakingly, parliamentary acts began to emerge, flimsy at first, riddled with loopholes, but acts nonetheless. They might forbid the youngest children from the blackest depths, or mandate slightly sturdier roof supports. Each regulation was a battle, fought against the relentless drive for coal at any cost. The air might still be thick, the work still bone-jarringly hard, but perhaps, just perhaps, the odds of returning to the surface, of breathing cleaner air under an open sky, began to inch upwards, ever so slightly. This wasn't a revolution in safety, not yet. It was more like a slow, painful crawl out of the darkest corners of neglect. For every small victory, there was the lingering taste of ash, the memory of the price paid. The journey towards a safer mine was paved not with good intentions alone, but with the hard, cold reality of tragedies that simply became too numerous, too horrific, to ignore completely. And still, the earth held its dangers, waiting. And so the miners continued their descent, day after weary day, into a world that grudgingly yielded its treasures. Each swing of the pickaxe, each laden cart hauled through the narrow, suffocating tunnels, was a testament to a stubborn persistence. The glimmers of better safety, hard-won as they were, did little to change the bone-deep exhaustion, the ever-present dampness clinging to their rough-spun clothes, or the darkness that felt like a permanent stain beneath their eyelids, a shadow carried even into sleep. Consider, for a quiet moment, the sheer scale of it all. Imagine the mountains of coal, the rivers of iron ore, all wrested from the unyielding earth, one painful shovelful, one explosive blast at a time. These weren't abstract resources appearing as if by magic. They were the direct product of countless aching backs, of lungs slowly filling with rock dust, of hands so raw and calloused they barely registered the bite of the cold steel tools. An unseen underground army, toiling in flickering lamplight, fueling the roaring furnaces and clattering machines of a new age, their individual stories often lost in the grand impersonal narrative of progress. It's easy to forget, isn't it? Amidst the enduring marvels of that revolutionary era, the colossal human engine that powered its very heart. The true price was paid in shortened lives, in bodies broken far too young, in the quiet, pervasive grief of families who knew the mine often took more than it ever gave back. Yet, within that relentless, often brutal toil, there was a profound, almost defiant resilience, a strength born not of grand pronouncements or heroic ballads, but of simply enduring, of facing the damp, chill air at the pit mouth each morning, and choosing, once more, to descend into the deep. Their legacy is etched, not just in the towering factories or sprawling railways built above, but in the quiet, unyielding courage found deep within the belly of the earth, a testament to the spirit that refuses to be extinguished. Thank you for joining us on Plotfall. Until our next story, may your thoughts be calm and your rest deep.